Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's tutorial. In today's video I'm going to run through the steps and everything on how I've drawn this little robin here. Before we get into the tutorial though, if you want to watch this in real time with full voiceover so you can draw along with me as I'm drawing it, then head on over to my Patreon page, or you can head on over to my website where there is a 6-part tutorial of this little bird that you can follow along and draw with me. As always, all of the materials and everything that I've used throughout this tutorial and drawing are listed in the description below, and if you follow the Jackson's Art links in the UK, then you get 10% off your first order. How snazzy is that? So this is a drawing that I started back in November and I finally managed to complete it. So the first thing that I've done is added that little beady black eye that you can see there. So for that I used a dark sepia pencil and I just gently outlined that highlight area that you can see at the top of the eye as well. Just outlined it and then gently shaded it and then made sure that the shape and everything was correct, and then I've gone in with a hard pressure and further layers to really cement that eye there. So what I did is just built up the layers of the dark sepia to create a nice round eye there. That's the only colour I used on the eye because there wasn't very much detail or any other colours that I could see in the eye, and bird eyes tend to be quite dark and beady anyway, so I just stuck with the dark sepia pencil for this. I then added all of the lovely orangey red breast and feathers around the eye. So I used a limited colour palette for this robin tutorial, and I didn't actually use any red pencils. I basically just used some yellows. I used some raw sienna from the Luminance, and then I used orange, burnt ochre and burnt siennas. So I used about 5 or 6 colours to create the orange and the red tones within the breast and that sort of coloured bit that you can see on the bird. So I started off with my lighter layers, so I laid down some warm grey one and then built up with some brown ochre, some light yellow ochre, slowly building up until I got to those darkest colours. So the darkest colours for me were some burnt ochre from the Luminance and also some burnt sienna from the Polychromos. So those are the main colours that I added in those darker reddy orange parts. So as I said, I didn't actually use any red tones for this. I just used the warm tones that you could get from the burnt sienna for this, and it actually worked out really well. So when you're creating feathers, it's really important that you stick to the feather direction, much like when you are drawing fur. So as I was continuing to draw this and add the feathers down, I was looking at the reference picture and I was noting the way in which the feathers were sitting. So you can see around the beak and the eye, the feathers are sort of pointing up and curving towards the right. And then as you look below the eye and below the beak, obviously the feathers are pointing downwards. So you want to make sure that you pay attention all the time to where the feather or the fur direction, whatever you're drawing, in this case the feathers, you want to pay attention to which way they are pointing and how they overlap one another, and you want to mimic that with your base layers. So you always want to work in the direction that feathers or anything is going in. For the beak, I wanted to make it look nice and smooth. So for this, I used a burnishing technique to try and get it really nice and smooth. So I didn't use any odorless mineral spirits or zest it or any kind of blender for this. I basically just blended out with a Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil, and I burnished and blended everything together throughout this entire portrait with that pencil. So for the beak, what I did is worked in exactly the same way as I usually do. I put down my base layers, so I put down some warm grey 1, some cold grey 1, some cold grey 3, and then I slowly built up to my darker colours. So my darkest colours on the beak were some walnut brown and some dark sepia. So all I did was just added a few layers, then burnished a little bit with a white pencil, continued to add layers and then burnished some more until I built up to my desired darkness on the beak there. And I ended up with a really smooth, sort of shiny looking beak. So for the brown feathers, for that transition between the red-orange feathers to the brown, all I did was just continued some of those orange colours into those sort of grey-brown feathers and brought some of those grey and brown tones into the orange as well, just to try and get a nice smooth transition, a nice even blend between the colours. And I just lightly layered. so that I could get that smooth transition. So when it comes to doing the brown feathers, I worked in exactly the same way as well, built from my lighter colours, so my warm grey one, built all the way up to my walnut brown. And for the brown feathers, I tended to use a lot of nougat and walnut brown and just slowly built the tone with those. So I just added layer upon layer, gradually increasing the pressure on my pencil as well until I got to the desired tone. I also, for that sort of yellowy hint that you can see, and you can just see me added the pencil there, for that I added the brown ochre polychromos pencil, and you can see exactly how I'm layering on this. As I'm layering everything down, you can see that it's looking quite grainy, and that's why I blend out and burnish with that white pencil. If I wasn't to use any kind of blending or burnishing method, then it would still end up looking quite grainy, and when you have something that looks like that, it can look quite unrealistic. So I just use my white pencil to burnish everything out. I also use the other colours of my pencils as well, so you can see I'm slowly burnishing with the nougat pencil just there, and also going back in with some of the lighter colours, so the cold grey and the warm grey, but mainly I use the white pencil to burnish. And you can see as I'm adding that white pencil over, it's just smoothing everything out. It's also diluting the colour a little bit, but that's okay because then I can go over and glaze some colours over the top. But you can see that as I'm adding that white pencil, that it is just smoothing everything out. It's getting rid of the grain of the paper because I'm smushing everything into the tooth of the paper and making it really nice and smooth. And then I'm going back over with my colours to bring back some luminosity of the colour, because when I'm using the white pencil it often washes the colour out, so you just have to go over and glaze some colours over the top. But there's no denying how smooth those feathers, those brown feathers, look now compared to how they did when I was putting down just the base layers. So for the breast, you can see I'm continuing the bottom half now. You can see again how I am layering. I've put down a really light base layer, so for this I used the warm grey one. And then I've put in my yellow layer, so that I've used some light yellow ochre again from the polychromos. And you can see that everything's looking quite grainy, and then as I'm slowly building up the colours, I'm adding in some raw sienna from the luminance, and then I've gone in and blended and burnished with that white pencil, and you can see that it really knocks that colour back, it really dilutes the colour. But then as soon as you add some more colours over the top, it brings back that luminosity and everything looks really nice and smooth, and you've eliminated a lot of that grain of that paper. So to create some sort of texture with the feathers, all I've done is just use my Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil to add a few highlights here and there, and then I've gone in with my shadows, and for this I'm looking at where those dark parts are on the reference photo and just adding that in with my pencil. So it's really important for realism to get the contrast and the values within your portrait correct. If you don't have your shadows and your lights in the right place, or your shadows and lights light enough and dark enough, then everything can look kind of off and it can give a sort of unrealistic feel to your portrait. So you really need to make sure that you always pay attention to those contrasts and pay attention to where you need to darken something. So a tip that I would give you for when you're doing your drawings is to just take a step back every now and then and just look and see if you've got all of those values in the right place. So now I'm continuing the feathers on the underside of the bird here, and most of these feathers are really quite grey and sort of cold in tone. So for that all I've used is a base layer of cold grey one, so this is different to the warm grey one. Obviously in cooler, more blue toned areas here you'd like to use the cooler tone pencil, so that's why I've switched to the cold grey one for this. Then I've slowly built up, just layered and gradually increasing the pressure on my pencil and built up the layers where the feathers are at its darkest. So that's mainly where I've got some of these pine needles that the robin's sitting on, where they're overlapping and the bird is actually sitting in like a nest of pine needles. So that's where most of the shadows are, and that's where I've concentrated a lot more pressure and a lot more layers. I've then gone in with a cold grey 3 pencil and continued to darken up a few areas because the cold grey 1 pencil just wasn't cutting it, so I had to switch to a cold grey 3 and then eventually added a few touches of the dark sepia as well to really make those shadows dark. So the texture of feathers is pretty similar to when you're drawing fur, except with feathers you want to make them look quite nice and smooth. You want to make it a lot more smooth than you would draw fur. So when you're coming to adding those details on those final layers, you tend to not add as many details. You can see that on the grey parts I've just added a few lines here and there, mainly with the white pencil and then with the dark sepia pencil, so the lightest and the darkest to get those contrasts in. With fur, what I would tend to do is add a lot more lines than this. So with feathers, if you imagine a feather in your head, they're really kind of soft and silky, and that's the kind of texture that you want to try and mimic when you're drawing birds. So you want to make sure that you burnish and blend everything a little bit more than what you would do if you was drawing a fur. So the trickiest part of this portrait was actually rendering the wings, and that's because you've got all of these individual lines, you've got all of these sort of shadows and separation marks where the feathers are slightly parted, you've got all of that to contend with, and it can get a little bit tricky. But what I tend to do to manage this is just take it really slow. I really take my time when I'm doing the wings and doing this kind of work, and I just gently map out each line and each bit of the wing just by using light pressure with one of my darkest pencils. So what I've done is just use my dark sepia polychromosed pencil, and you can see that I'm just gently mapping out the lines, and then when I'm happy with the line and I agree that it's in the right place according to the reference photo, then I can go in and add a little bit more pressure and a little bit more shading where that's apparent on the reference photo. So you can see I've added in some darker parts towards the either ends of those lines on the wings there, and that's where things are darkest, and I've kept it quite light in the middle. So just going in with light pressure, just gently mapping everything out and getting everything correct, and then going in with a harder pressure, and then I'm going in and filling in all of the colour of the feathers. So I'm adding in my yellows, I'm adding in my browns, I'm shading everything up adequately, looking at the contrast and everything on those wings and adding the shadows in the appropriate areas. So again, that goes for the tail as well. For the tail, I've just added a base layer of the warm grey one. Again, you can see just how grainy it is before I go in and burnish and blend anything. And then I've added some yellow, so I've added that light yellow ochre, and then I've burnished out with that white pencil, and then I've continued to add all of my colours over the top. So I've added those darker colours, again mapped in any lines or any textures and any kind of details that I can see, and consolidated that against my reference photo before I've gone in and darkened anything up with harder pressure. So one tip that I can give you for when you're drawing feathers is to always make sure that you maintain a fine point on your pencil, especially when you're adding in all of those fine detail lines and you're sort of mapping everything out. Having a nice sharp pencil will allow you to put less pressure through your pencil, so you're not damaging the tooth of the paper as well. So having a sharp pencil whilst you're mapping everything out will enable you to limit the amount of pressure, preserve the tooth of your paper, and then you can go in with harder pressure and then really darken everything up. So always make sure that you use a really sharp pencil to enable you to get all of those really fine sharp details in, and to limit the damage that you can actually do by putting pressure on a blunter pencil through your paper. So now I'm just filling in the bottom half of the wing, and I'm applying exactly the same technique as I did for the top half of the wing. So for this I'm going in again with light pressure and a really sharp pencil, and then I'm just making sure that I've got all of those lines and all of those feather separations in exactly the right place, and then going in with hard pressure. So you can see there that I just erased a little bit as well, because I just made a slight mistake on the shape of the wing. So by using lighter pressure, it allowed me to be able to erase that line and those mistakes that I made. If I'd gone in with a blunter pencil and a little bit of a harder pressure, then it would have taken me a while to actually lift the colour off of the paper, but because I used those light layers and that light technique of very lightly layering with my pencil, I was able to just lift the colour really, really easily, and you can't even see that I had actually made a mistake on that part. So now I'm completing the bird just by adding these feathers on the back. I'm applying exactly the same technique as I did for those grey feathers where it interconnects there. So just using light layers, making sure I've got really sharp pencils and adding in those darker colours in those darker areas. So I'm not adding all of those darker colours all over, I'm just adding it in the spaces where it's necessary. And again, that's mainly on the underside of the bird and underneath the wing where it's sitting there. So that's pretty much it, all my tips and techniques that I have for you when you're trying to render a similar subject. So perhaps you're drawing a similar bird and you wanted a few tips on how to draw feathers. I hope I've given you a few ideas and a few sort of tips on how you can use your layering process and blending when you're trying to render feathers. If you liked this tutorial, then please make sure that you give it a thumbs up, and a share is always appreciated with your arty friends. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel as well, because I've got a really special video coming for you this Sunday. It's something a little bit different and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, tick that bell icon so you can get notified as soon as that video is released. Don't forget to follow me on all of my social media sites. I'm on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And don't forget that you can always share your photos with me. So if you've been inspired by one of my tutorials, make sure that you share a photo with me. So post it to my Facebook page timeline. You can tag me on Instagram. You can email me if you want to. My email address is attached at the bottom in the description of the YouTube channel. Just share your work with me. I always love to see it. But anyway guys, I really hope you enjoyed this one and I will see you in Sunday's video. Bye!